So, like I said, this session's going to operate a little differently. We're not going to have kind of formal presentations, but we're going to have more of a dialogue. We're very lucky to have Marissa Gerstein-Pinot here joining us before she flies back to Washington or somewhere else this afternoon. Okay. I'll introduce the presenters kind of formally, and then just kind of regroup our purpose for this dialogue, and then each panelist will kind of talk about who they are, what they do, where they're coming from, what they're up to, their perspectives, and then we'll kind of dive into some guided questions too. This is kind of an open session too with you all, so if you do have questions, I'll be kind of scanning, and feel free to join the dialogue, ask questions, the like. So without further ado, Marissa Gerstein-Pinot, if you weren't here for the morning, she's a researcher and senior associate with Frameworks Institute, based in Washington, D.C., bridging research interpretation and applications units. Sociologist by training, Marissa has focused her research on gender and family, medicine, culture, and public policy. Prior to joining Frameworks, she served as a program officer with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, where she worked with panels of leading experts on a variety of topics. Marissa received her BA in sociology from the New College of Florida and her MA and PhD in sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles. Janine Vanderberg launched her Encore career in 2018. After 3 decades of leading Joining Vision in Action, the consulting firm she started in 1987 that has helped thousands of individuals and organizations involved in community and social change. Her new venture, Encore Roadmap, helps older adults develop social purpose businesses, advocates for age-friendly entrepreneurial policies, connects those entering the social sector with Encore mentors, and helps to change the narrative about older people and the economy. She is a certified Frameworks Institute master trainer in reframing aging. She's currently launching and directing Change the Narrative in Colorado, a statewide strategic communications campaign funded by Next 50 Initiative and the Rose Community Foundation to shift public perception about aging and ageism. And last but not least, Shunloi Fong is a director of communications for Cultivate, formerly Boulder County Care Connect. I don't know when we stop saying that, but we'll stop saying that soon, I think. A Boulder-based nonprofit that helps older adults flourish by connecting them as recipients and contributors with their surrounding communities. And he's also the founder of A Shared Humanity, a design studio and story incubator that helps individuals and organizations grow their impact through the power of shared human experiences with a diverse background in visual media, design, and tech. As Shunloi brings a passion for leveraging a diversity of tools, both online and offline, to build collaborations that contribute to a world as it ought to be. So, with that, I just want to kind of, now it's going to get a little messy. So,
Can't wait.
I just kind of wanted to initiate this by saying we'll be talking about the research end of things and the work that Frameworks is doing and how that's kind of entering into Colorado through the project that Janine is working on, but also bring in story and storytelling. And I think recently, within the last few years, storytelling as an idea and a practice has gotten a lot more attention in the private sector as well as, I think, the public sector and nonprofits as another way to engage with audiences and effectively communicate. And that can be through, marketing a product to writing grants or advocating for public policies and public funding. And so to accommodate our diversity in the audience in terms of where you're coming from, be it advocacy, nonprofit work, public agencies, private organizations, or for-profit companies, we want to try to speak to all of those interests as much as we can, and certainly raise a hand or ask some questions where you might want to prod a little bit more or ask one of us to unpack something or dive into something. So that's kind of the idea. Hope it works. And so what we'll do is this first part is I'll kind of ask a question to each of our panelists. They'll spend some time talking a bit more in depth about who they are and what they do and their work. And then after we do that, we'll kind of open it up with some dialogue and some driving questions. So I'm going to sit down now. So my first question is, can everybody hear me? Okay, so my first question is for you, Marissa. So can you tell us more about how you see the frameworks, research, and toolkits influencing communities across America? And what do you want organizations and companies to be aware of as the work of frameworks expands and starts to percolate?
So I think probably in answering all the really amazing questions that came up after I presented earlier, I previewed some of what I would answer here. But I think to explain a little bit more about what Frameworks does generally is we get money usually from foundations to address a particular social problem. And so these are often big funders, so the Grant Makers in Aging is an example of that. We've also gotten money from the MacArthur Foundation, the Gates Foundation, et cetera, depending on what their particular focus is. And they're the ones who fund our research, which are 1.5 to 2 year processes, because we're all PhDs, which means we like to take some time to do our research. Compared to academics, though, we're like that. And then once we've done the research, we create various reports, toolkits, other things that advocates can go out and use to help create a new communication strategy. So we don't brand, we don't design websites, we create communication strategies that can be applied by the people who are really doing the work in the field. And as I think I mentioned earlier, we own our intellectual property. So Grant Makers in Aging funded the work that we did, but it's ours, and we do that on purpose because we want great frames to get into the hands of as many people as possible, because framing works best in high doses. So we want all of you to have access to the work that we did so that you can apply it into your communication strategies. So that generally lives on our website, but then we also do a lot of work like I'm doing today, where we come out and do presentations, do trainings, we do workshops, we do what we call frame checking, where people will send us their communications and we'll literally go line by line and help people reframe their communications. And another thing that we did with this project, which I think is really cool, is we trained people like Janine, who live in different parts of the country, because I work on a team of about 5 people, to create a whole group of really well-trained presenters who can do workshops, et cetera, and spread the frames all over the country. So we're actually this project is really lucky in that we managed to more than double our capacity to help people. So I think the result of that has been really positive, because we only finished this work about a year and a half ago, and we're already seeing the work being taken up all across the country, definitely here in Colorado. The state of Maine and also New Hampshire have really taken up this work, and there's sort of a regional campaign that's going on in New England right now on how to reframe aging and talk about aging in more positive ways. But we've done work in Florida. My colleague Jen spoke at the American Society on Aging not too long ago. So it's really, we have a really, I think, wide reach. And the beautiful thing about what we do, for me anyway, is because we work at the level of culture, we look at how our culture influences the way people think and talk about aging, and then find frames that work with that culture to create more understanding, better attitudes, more policy support. Our work has a really long shelf life, because culture is dynamic, but it's also very durable. Like, we add new ideas into our culture, but the ideas we had in the past didn't go away. They're still there. So that means that work that we did, in the past 3 years is going to continue to work to talk about aging in 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. The work that we did on early childhood development 20 years ago, we still are training people on a regular basis on how to use it. And so that's my hope for the aging work too, is that people continue to come to us and say, hey, I need some help with reframing. I'd love a presentation or a workshop, and we can still provide that way down the line. So does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And just a follow-up, I guess. So how do you see, what kind of change do you want to see? And how would you measure that at the national level? I mean, obviously through things being picked up in certain states or certain institutions, you know, deploying the toolkits or, you know, signing on, or however you want to say it. But what kind of, how would you see success in this work?
So so there's various ways to measure success, I think short-term and long-term. A reframing process generally is a very long-term endeavor. As I said, we did that work on early child development 20 years ago. It's really seeped into the discourse. You see it a lot in media. You now see it in legislation in various places. The state of Tennessee has taken up our work and saved in times where budgets were being slashed, saved money for adverse childhood experiences and helping children in need using our frames, which was really exciting. So my hope is that this aging work is going to continue to kind of seep out into our general discourse, have the media and also organizations that care about aging and work on aging using the frames more and more and more so people get those heavy doses. And that have those frames end up in policy, end up in programming, end up in people's budgets, end up in the mouths of policymakers and legislators. Like, that would be fantastic, in my opinion. And I think we're set up for that to potentially happen, as long as, you know, we have really great buy-in from a lot of groups. And right now it seems like we're getting that buy-in. So.
Great. So Janine, can you share the work of Changing the Narrative Colorado? How did this work come about? What are you doing? What are you working on here in Colorado related to that project? What kinds of outcomes are you seeing, or what kind, you know, how are individuals and groups and organizations picking up from it locally?
That's a long question. There are other parts of it too, so I'm
There
prepared
are.
to answer all of it. Okay. So first, let me ask, I kind of want to find out who's in the room. Could you raise your hand if you're with a nonprofit? Okay. Government? For-profit? Hybrid, social enterprise, B Corps? Okay. Policy advocacy groups? Okay. Thank you. Finding you after. Okay, great. And so one of the reasons I'm asking that is we've found, and I think when we started the initiative in 2018, and then I'll go backwards and answer some of your questions, we thought that most of the workshops that we would be doing were strictly with this category called aging advocates. And we soon realized that framing and how messaging about older people and about ageism, it turns up in so many places. So it turns up in policy advocacy shops that might say, because they want a policy advance, use the term silver tsunami, and you might have heard from Marissa this morning why that's a terrible idea. So we've really thought more expansively beyond what one might simply consider, quote, an aging advocate. So it's always helpful for me to find out who's in the room. So Changing the Narrative is basically a strategic communications and awareness campaign. We have this really big goal that we want to do, and so we agree it'll take a long time. We literally, and it's in our tagline, we want to end ageism in Colorado together. We want to do it with a lot of people. How it came about, so there's been a lot of work going on in Colorado, and probably many of you have been a part of it, kind of about how we changed thinking about older adults and viewing them as assets instead of deficits. Rose Community Foundation, who's one of the major funders of this initiative, along with Next 50, very prominent in this work for over a decade in Colorado, advancing the work based on encore.org, but that older adults can be an incredible asset to our community. So there's been a lot of funding and interest in that area. I think Social Venture Partners in Boulder, for example, has Encore Fellow and that kind of thing. So a lot of interest in that. Rose Community Foundation, so the tie to the frameworks work is Rose Community Foundation was also one of the original funders who, with the leading aging organizations that you probably heard about in Marissa's presentation this morning, was funding Frameworks Institute work. So about 2 years ago, Rose approached the company that I then headed and said, we'd like you to help us think through what an initiative to change narrative and to reframe aging in Colorado might look like. We started kind of developing a logic model, some ideas. Therese Ellery, Senior Program Officer at Rose, sent me to the Frameworks Institute in training in DC just a little over a year ago. So I became a certified master trainer, and before I know it, in December, Rose Community Foundation had funded their portion of the initiative. Next 50 came in a little bit later. So in January, I found myself leaving the firm that I headed and leading this thing called Changing the Narrative. So what do? Part of it, and a big part of what we do, are reframing aging workshops. So the kind of things that Marissa talked about, they are the frameworks workshops on the new messaging, the frames, culture change, and all of that. We do 3-hour workshops, we do full-day workshops. We do them across the state. So this is my commercial plug. If you are interested in having a workshop kind of in your community, let me know. And because we are scheduling 2019 right now, and I know some of you in the room have already been to some of our workshops. So that's part of what we do. But we also knew that the training workshops were not going to be sufficient for the amount of culture change that we wanted. And we also knew that there were other narratives that we wanted to change. So another narrative that we wanted to change was this idea that people have that older workers are not valuable. And this idea that even older workers themselves sometimes have, that we should get out of the way for younger people. So we know that there have been 4 major studies that show that actually the economy overall and younger workers are better off when older workers stay in the workforce. So we ended up putting together kind of the business case for age-friendly and multi-generational workforces. Those of you who are in the front rows have copies of these, but there are additional copies on the front rows if you want to take one. And so part of what we're doing are also presentations to businesses, to HR people, on the business case for age-friendly and multi-generational workforces. Another thing that we realized initially when we were doing some of the frameworks presentations, there were members of the general public in the audience who said, well, I'm not in a position where I am reframing the language of my organization, but I really want to talk to people I know about ageism. So we've recruited a group of people called change agents, and they're basically volunteers, and they do basically house parties. And they go, and within their own networks and circles, they do kind of like presentations and facilitate discussions on how do we talk about ageism and what are things that we can do to get rid of ageism and that kind of thing. We're also doing a social media campaign. We're doing earned media and that kind of thing. What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? I actually pasted them in from our logic model. We are trying to increase understanding of aging and ageism by those participating in our work. We want to see, over time, increased use of messaging with the research-based frames. We want to see that diffusion that Marissa talked about. We're hoping that we want to see improved attitudes and beliefs about age-friendly funding solutions and policies. We want to see reduced use of negative and destructive stereotypes about older people, kind of like that horrific political ad that I think Marissa showed in her, that we actually launched somewhat of a campaign, and we got people to go to Nail Communications and post on their Facebook, and we got some of the leading aging organizations we were working with to write letters, and we want to see change policies and practices. How are we doing so far? So we just started in January, but since that time we have done 35 of the frameworks reframing aging workshops across the state, have reached over 1,200 people so far, and we have 12 more workshops scheduled before the end of the year. After every workshop, we do a workshop evaluation, so we know now about 88% say that they will use the recommendations, 92% agree it increased their knowledge of ageism, 94% that they understand now what makes for effective messages, and most important to me is that over 90% of people who participate in our workshops say they intend to do something to address it and they intend to use the frame. So we have a process of follow-up evaluation, and we'll see what actual use is, and we're trying to find out what barriers are. But that's kind of what we've been doing so far.
It's a ton of work.
I'm tired.
Very ambitious.
Yeah. It's great. It's fun. No, it's fun.
So, so that's kind of the frameworks part of the introduction,
Right.
and Chun-Loi is going to talk about more on the communication side and storytelling, and with a disclaimer that Chun-Loi is not frameworks disciple. I don't know what the word would be.
But will be at the
I
end.
will be at the end of this
We're
one.
groupies.
So
Should have my
really
little
our
frameworks
purpose
pen.
here is
You
to,
need pens.
you know, to understand a little bit more about what's happening in the frameworks work and what's happening in Colorado, and for Shinloy to talk a little bit more about his experience from a communications and storytelling background, and also kind of a rebranding experience as well. And then our dialogue will really kind of try to fuse the two and talk about both elements.
Well, I'm going to jump up here because I have, for those of you that are visual, I put some of the things I'll just share with you onto the slide so you can at least see. When it comes to speaking, though, I'm terrible at multitasking. So if I'm still on the first slide when I'm done, there's a reason for that. But I'll try to remember to bring them down or to go from slide to slide. I told Jacob yesterday there's so much to talk about with storytelling, and I'd love nothing more than to have 2 days with you guys, to walk through the process of the role that story can play in each of your organizations, as well as developing kind of the conceptual framework as well as the strategic framework for really infusing story into every aspect of your organization. But I have 10 minutes, and so I'm just going to, in these 10 minutes, just share with you a little bit about my beginnings of an approach to storytelling as it might play out for different organizations. Here's where I'd start as kind of a baseline posture or attitude that I take with storytelling. We live in a world where people crave authentic connection, right? They crave meaningful experiences with other people. They crave a sense of belonging in a community. And because of that, in the world in which we live, right, there's so much content, there's so many stories, there's so much noise that all of us here in this room, we actually have amazing opportunities to really move beyond the status quo of storytelling and communications and really embracing story in a way that connects with real human beings. Right? We have the opportunity to create authentic relationships with people that move beyond demographics or data points or metrics or things like that. See, I've already forgotten to move on. Here we go. So we have that opportunity to engage story in that way. When we take kind of a holistic perspective about the role that story can play in our organizations, we have amazing opportunity to really grow our brands, but even more importantly, to grow our impact in the community. So that's like my kind of posture, understanding kind of some of those deep desires that just as human beings that we have, and embracing story in a way that begins to meet those needs. But what I want to do is take a step back, okay? Because, is that coming from me? I can speak loud.
Turn it off and turn it on again.
I can speak loud. Can you all hear me? If I speak really loudly? All right. Hello? Testing. Are you out there? I'm going to turn this off. Okay,
Yeah,
I'm just
turn
gonna
it
speak
off.
All right. So I want to take a step back regarding, talk a little bit about what I mean when I'm talking about story. Because story is, as Jacob was talking about, like it's gotten more attention. It's kind of become a buzzword. And it's become a buzzword for a reason, because we're wired for story. Like story is core to who we are. So all of a sudden it became really popular. But my guess is a lot of us in this room, and no judgment, like I would be the same way not too long ago, that we might not even be able to identify or explain like what makes a compelling story, right? What are the components of a story? Is this working? Is
Yeah.
it? Or is it just a prop here?
You can
Okay,
hide
so
behind it.
what I want to do is just so that we're kind of having a shared understanding of what I'm talking about with story. On a very basic level, the structure of story is you identify a problem, you identify a solution to that problem, and then there's a resolution, that when someone engages that solution, they experience some sort of resolution. That's story on a very, very basic level. But that plays out very practically in your organizations. It might be in your web copy, it might be in the emails that you send out, it might be when you meet someone at a conference, it might be the way you answer your phone, your advertising. Like you can infuse story into all of the things that you communicate. Okay, so that's a very basic definition. Now, if we expand that a little bit, if you look at like Hollywood, is this thing like really jumping in and out?
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just talk really loud.
I'm just gonna talk loud. Call it. you know, if you look at some of the famous movies out there, right, like Star Wars or Harry Potter, back in the day, Wizard of Oz, right, like they all share a similar structure to their story. And that is that every great story has a hero, right? The hero wants something, but they have a problem that's preventing them from getting what they want. And sometimes that problem is I feel like I'm the one that's causing it. Should I just like walk around the room?
We're all starting to think that.
Oh, maybe it's the phone.
It might be the phone.
Yeah.
Testing 1, 2.
All right.
Keep
I'm
going.
just going to keep going. All right. I feel like
Stand further and further away.
I'm a walker anyway, so this is kind of fun. Maybe I'll look it up.
There's a good story emerging here, Sean.
You're going to tell it.
Yeah, I am.
So, a hero wants something, but they have a problem that they can't overcome. And remember, you're not the hero, they are, right? You need to be a guide to them, but if you don't know their problems, then you can't tell stories that help them solve their problems, right? So you have to spend time with them to understand how best to engage them with story. And the third practice is when you know yourself and you understand your audience, you can bring those pieces together and share together. Now, if I get up and I tell you a story, it could be a really great story, and it could be very moving and inspiring, whatever it might be. But if we all go out for drinks after this and we're sharing our stories with each other, that's a much more powerful collective story that we're building together. So when you understand yourself and you understand your audience and you bring those together and share life together, share experiences and stories together, you build a more powerful collective story. Okay, so that is like the conceptual framework, and when you figure that out, some of those pieces, then it helps you then to figure out like, well, okay, strategically, what should we do? Okay, right? And you can build your strategic framework for how you tell stories. Okay, a few notes that I want to make, and then I want to finish up. Number one is you got to experiment a lot. You got to take risks. You have to fail. If you don't have some failed stories, you're not pushing hard enough, because there are so many ways to tell stories, to facilitate stories. You got to try different things. But don't do it just to do it. You need to understand, how do I know if this is successful or not, right? So you need to understand your data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. You need to know, like, this was successful, this resonated with our community, let's continue with that or not. Right? But you got to experiment a lot, try different things. Second thing is give value. Always give more value than you ask. And this is part of the problem when organizations make themselves the hero, is that all of a sudden they're the hero with a problem and they need help with something. We need your money. We need you as a volunteer. We need you to give us your knowledge or your resources. But when you realize that they're the hero and that you're the mentor that you can come alongside them, you can give them more value. And the beautiful thing is when you do that, you become the hero to them. And you have this collective shared story. So when you ask for something, give money, buy this product, whatever it might be, they're going to be much more invested and willing to give back because you gave them value in the first place. The third thing is create ways for your community to participate, right? If you take the time to listen to them, you start building relationships with them, you understand their needs, right? You can trust them to participate and contribute, which makes life a lot easier. If you're responsible for telling your organization stories, right? If you have to tell 100 stories, that's really hard on your own. But if you can bring your whole community in to help contribute to those 100 stories, it makes life a lot easier. The fourth piece is what is called an omni-channel approach or multi-channel approach, and it's kind of a marketing speak. But basically what it means is as you build your stories, do it in a way that can be repurposed across multiple channels. Right? Don't just create a video, it goes on YouTube, and it can never be used anywhere else. You want to think about how your stories go across your different channels, so that way, no matter what touch point people come to you at, they're having the same cohesive experience and engaging the same story. So that's something to think about on a strategic level as you create your stories. Okay, to finish up, if nothing else, right, facilitate the living out, I'll read it, of stories that create authentic connections, meaningful experiences, and greater sense of belonging. Right, it's going to help you better serve your community, make a greater impact, and grow your brand. Right? And the collective story that you all live together is going to be way more powerful and rewarding and transformative than if you're just getting up and kind of telling a story. So my last point, and then I'll quit here, is I actually don't agree with the title of this panel. Like, let's not tell our story. Let's live our story. Let's facilitate stories, because that's going to be way more powerful in bringing the community together. So.
Is this on? Yes. Hello? Yes? All right. Okay. Cool. So now now we're going to fuse. So
This is where it gets messy.
this is where it gets even messier, maybe.
Right.
So, we've got practitioner, we've got researcher, and we've got kind of in between. Fuser, right? So where, I was thinking when Chinloy was talking, like, from a nonprofit space, it's like we have a client, we tell the story, or we talk about that client, right? And in some cases, it might just be we have a program, or a service, or a product in some cases, and we say client X did this, and this was achieved, or to some effect, that's kind of the basic ingredients of a story. so how, if an organization that has, an approach to storytelling which is pretty straightforward, and in some cases the intention is maybe just to promote and advertise through a client's experience, how might an organization be more intentional in those communications? So what should a communicator, and it could be somebody testifying in front of a city council, or it could be somebody running an ad in a newspaper or online, or even a Facebook post or whatever. How do you suggest an organization or a person in that role approach that process? And considering what you've said, and also the work of frameworks, and trying to really activate the research and activate what suggestions you're offering. That's an open question.
Can I add a question?
Yeah.
So it's kind of the same thing, but I think if we make it more specific,
Yeah.
it might. So here's what happens. Every time I do a workshop and I say, do not tell the story of sad senior, poor Emma who got evicted because of gentrification in Boulder and her belongings are now on the sidewalk. People are like, okay. Then they go back and they say, I talked to my grant writer, she says you're crazy. So, so if I can cue it up that way to you, Marissa, because I really want to know your answer.
Sure. So I think the work that we do is a little bit different because we're not telling stories about, well, we do tell stories about our organization, everybody does, but our focus is on telling stories for social change. And the basis of our theory of change is that if people understand social problems better, then it's going to lead to social change. So we do think about storytelling a little bit differently because we think about how do we tell a story that can create that social change. So as I said, actually, you missed it, but this morning somebody asked a question about kind of individuals. And we do have fairly strong feelings about individual stories, and I would never say don't tell an individual story. Individual stories are powerful, definitely. The problem is when you only tell an individual story, you are leading people to think about that individual, their individual problems, and the individual solutions to solve their problems. So I'm just going to give an example of some work that we found that kind of inspired some of what we were doing, which was a short documentary about a woman who was living on her own. I don't remember what city she was in now. I don't know if you've seen this, Janine, but she was very isolated. She couldn't see well. There was no transportation around her to take her to a senior center or anything. Her children were very busy. They couldn't visit her very often. So what did she do? She hung out in her home and she took mail and she shredded it. And that's what kept her hands busy, and it's what kept her going day after day, was shredding mail. So her apartment had all this shredded mail. And I don't recall now if this was an advertisement. It might have just been a short documentary. But people's response when they saw it, well, what do you think their response was when they saw it? How sad, and what was the solution they came up with? They sent her more mail. So, that narrow focus on an individual that didn't have that wide angle lens, which didn't explain the reason why this person is isolated is not because they have crappy children or, their health is deteriorating, but it's because they don't have access to services, transportation, senior centers, health services. Their children don't have support for caregiving that would make their lives better. And if people knew that, they would then think about solutions that were solutions like better transportation, better health care centers, better senior centers, right? So we actually, in our work that we did on elder abuse and neglect, we actually tested a story that worked out really well where we took kind of an encapsulated version of that, but surrounded it with the frames I presented earlier. So it started with talking about how we're innovative people, or actually this one used social justice. We found that worked really well for elder abuse. In a just society, we would take care of the people who are aging in our society. this is the reason that elder abuse and neglect happens is because we lack social supports and we need all these different supports. Here's an example of a person who, because that things aren't working the way they need to work, is facing a lot of difficulty. Here are the solutions that we know work. So that's just a different way of telling stories than that sort of super pointed, let's tug the heartstrings. Right. And we talked about this a little on our call a few weeks ago too. Every communication you put out, whether it's for fundraising, whether it's to bigger funders, whether it's to people who are part of your organization, are always an opportunity to increase people's understanding. So even if okay, fundraising is going to work a little better if we tell that heart-tugging story, that doesn't mean you can't surround it by that context and hope that people understand, okay, what we need are social supports, and these are the specific supports that would help that individual person and everybody. So I would just encourage you to always think about, when you're crafting any communication, how can we increase people's understanding and then increase their support for the things that all of us know are really effective at helping us live well?
And so one of the things that we've learned in our first 10 months of doing workshops with nonprofits and government is that a lot of people are struggling with how to do that. So one of the things, and we're about completing, and then they'll be available on our website for people who have taken our workshops, is we put together basically a series of fundraising and grant proposal templates that reframe a lot of, so whether you're providing you're involved in housing or support services, home delivered meals, or different categories of workforce that help you reframe. So as I think I had this recognition, the people on our team had this recognition, we could ask 1,200 people to all figure this out themselves, or we could kind of create a series of things that surround the frame. So anyway, look to our website, and it's on, I think it's somewhere on here, I hope. Our designer put our website on there, but we're trying to create some tools that will make it easier for everybody to take the frames, apply it to their own work, so you can move away from the individual story to those stories that widen the lens and show more what the social issues are that are at play.
I don't remember the original question, but I think
But it was a good one.
But it was a great one, yeah. Okay. I think the example is a great one about, this very detailed story of this lady, and I think part of the problem with there's a number of problems with telling the story that way. It's certainly kind of on just that very negative perspective and leaving it at that. But I think part of the problem also is what I talked about, where you're making this lady in the story the hero, and the person who's reading the story, they don't experience the same external problem that she's experiencing. So they can't even see themselves in that story. Whereas when you dig deeper, you take the time to find what's the real problem that this lady's facing. Not that the external problem isn't a real problem, it is, but what's the deeper internal problem that's very human? Then when your listener engages that story, they can begin to see themselves in that story. And so I think that's an important aspect of it, is really understanding what problem are we trying to address here in this story. But I really agree also with the kind of that aspect of it. If someone tells this story and they just focus in on this lady and her details and her problems and things like that, I would just say that's a really bad story. A good story, you also need to zoom out a little bit and have that wide lens to really understand the full context of the story. I'll use Star Wars as an example again, right? Like if you started that movie and all you saw were like all the little details of his life, before he discovered his story and history, and then he started moving on from there, but you didn't understand the broader perspective of what was going on in the empire and the rebellion and all these different factors that played in, it just wouldn't be as good of a story. And so I do think it's important to, and not just for the sake of a good story, mind you, even to accomplish some of these different objectives. We might have different objectives for our stories, and we have to figure that out. But kind of just in a theoretical standpoint, zooming out and understanding that wider lens, whether it's for the purposes that you're talking about or other purposes, it's really important to have both. The individual stories are good, but you got to understand the bigger picture as well. Yeah. So.
So I've got like 5 ideas in my head, so I just have to process that for a second. So it requires to even put energy into thinking about this, right? I have one question around why, like, in what's the case, sort of, in terms of organizations, and I know there's an advocacy social change element to it, but I want to go a little further into some of your experience, Janine. Why are people coming to you? Why have you already met with 1,200? You said 1,200.
I don't know. So we really thought, yeah.
And then
Yeah.
because it takes interest and it
Right.
takes agency
Yeah.
to get there and to do it, and then it takes a lot of proactivity when to intentionally message and to put more and to realize the impact and value of whenever we're messaging, however we're messaging.
Right. So I think that there are a couple of reasons. We literally thought, we started in January, and we thought, if we do, I don't know, 10 to 20 presentations and workshops by the end of 2018, that's going to be so great. And we're inundated, so we need another trainer in Colorado. Why people are coming. So I think, and this is not news to all of you, we know that funding for programs serving older people has shrunk at the same time. Population is dramatically increasing. We know that policy changes, and I think a lot of you working in community understand that policy changes are needed. So we've had people from who are starting age-friendly communities come to our workshops because they want kind of policies on a municipal, on a regional, on a statewide level, and they want to see those change, and they recognize that the stories that they're telling aren't working. What we know and what I love about the framework, metaphors, and values way of messaging, and the fact that it really emphasizes focusing on solutions, is that it works, and it's been tested to work. So I think as people realize, if we talk collectively in a different way, we might be able to influence funding decisions, we might be able to influence policy decisions. That would be a great thing. I want to talk about somewhat of a little bit of a policy win that we've already had. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging. Are any of you members of it here? SAPCA members. So we presented our business case to the Workforce Development Committee, and in the recommendations that they are making to the state of Colorado next week, there are going to be some of our recommendations, because again, we're positioning, we've got this potential in Colorado, we've got this increased longevity, it's a potential asset to community, but we need policies that can help older people stay in the workforce, retrain older people and that kind of thing, and those kind of policies are already. So I think people are ready for it, and certainly, I mean, look at all of you here. You realize that the stories that we're telling don't work, and they especially don't work when we are. What is it that funders say? Funders call, oh yeah, it's a cost to invest in older people programs, but it's an investment to fund programs for young children. I am totally and have always been in support of early childhood, but we need to think differently about how do we support age-friendly communities throughout the lifespan. So I think that's to me why people are coming. But we also recognize that we need to talk to funders, so we have done presentation to the Aging Dialogue Group in Colorado, which is a group of funders. I was at Grant Makers in Aging 2 weeks ago, presenting on our work to let funders know this is how the frameworks research, which they're familiar with, actually works on the ground. Here's what you need to know. So, again, and you heard about from Marissa this morning about the importance of movement building. If we all start talking in the same direction, I think we're going to have better outcomes, both in terms of policies that we need and in funding support for programs that we operate.
Organizational change is required in some cases, right? So, and especially, I've been in one of your workshops, and I've
You saw the
seen
resistance.
things manifest a little
Yeah.
bit too, like you bringing a brochure or a flyer
Right.
into a workshop, and identifying areas where some improvements could be made. So around that organizational change, I guess one question for you and then one question for you, Shinloy. Like, what are you seeing organizations, what kind of change are you seeing? And then Shinloy, I'd be curious to hear about your experience just in terms of rebranding, working with a nonprofit as it went through a rebranding experience in 2018, and why that happened and what that's looked like and what came out of that. So
So a big part of this is organizational change, and Margaret Frankhauser, who's the CEO of Next 50 Initiative, said at the outset, you know, Janine, this is going to be a big organizational change. And I was like, I've been a change management consultant for 30 years, so, and this has been about organizational change. So this idea, it's a little kind of swear jar, but with the word senior on it. One organization that was working with us, and their recommendation, they wanted to use older adult and older person instead of senior, and they had a lot of people who were really resisting that. So they kind of created this little swear jar. So if people use the word senior, they have to put $1 in the swear jar. The point of that is more that people are starting to recognize that it is not just the people who are coming to the workshop, that there are people throughout their organization that need to think differently, write differently, talk differently about aging and ageism and the people they serve. So so we've been helping people individually with that, but one of the things we're going to be doing in 2019 is literally after you take a reframing aging workshop, you can take other workshops on how do you drive deep this change within your organization. How do you get other people involved? We'll go out and we're going to spend more time helping people actually work with their teams, work with their boards, so they don't get the reaction of somebody coming to the workshop and being highly enthusiastic and then coming up against a board member who's like, well, there's no way we're doing that. So that's kind of some of the things that we're planning to do.
To answer the question about rebranding, yeah, so Cultivate went through a rename and rebrand process in 2017 and 18. We launched it in the middle of May. Just to give you a little bit of history about how that came about, when I came on staff in early 2017, part of it was with the idea of helping the organization walk through this rebrand process. And one thing that I discovered was that we were called Boulder County Care Connect, and we had a really strong sense of what we did. Right, we provide grocery delivery services, medical rides, yard cleaning, snow removal, and basic fixes in people's homes. And that's what we did, and those are really good things. But what I discovered is that we didn't necessarily have a stronger or deeper sense of our why. Why do we exist? Not just what we do, why do we exist? That no matter what we do, it grows out of that why. And so that was part of the process was, it's not that people in the organization didn't necessarily know that, it had just never been formalized as a team. And as we dug into that, discovering that the name, it had some practical challenges, but it also had some deeper philosophical challenges for us. So that was kind of what kickstarted some of those elements of rebranding. Maybe I'll just make a couple comments about, if you're considering rebranding or building your brand, right? Again, that's kind of a buzzword. We talk about it, like what does that really mean? So here's a few thoughts on it. Number one thing to remember is that your brand is not what you say it is. No one cares what you say it is. Your brand is what everyone else says it is, right? You can say we're a really friendly, approachable brand. And when you pick up the phone and you answer them, you're like, what do you want, right? Like, okay, that doesn't jive, right? So the person listening to the phone on the other side of the phone is like, that's not your brand, right? So your brand is defined by the people in your community that engage you. So that's one thing. That doesn't mean you can't influence your brand, but you can't dictate your brand. A second thing that I'll point out is that your brand is really the sum total of every experience or touch point that your audience has with you, right? So you can tell these amazing stories, but if people call you and they have a bad experience on the phone, that just diminished your brand, right? And so all those pieces contribute to your brand. So when I talk about story, like that's why I talk about infusing every aspect of your organization with story, because every touch point is story and it influences your brand. If you have 100 people in your organization, your communications department has 100 people in it. Right? If you have 50 people in your organization, your communications department is 50 people. I have the easy job, actually. I'm oftentimes just sitting in the office doing a lot of the behind-the-scenes strategy, things like that. Like, it's our people who are out in the field, on the phone. Like, they're the ones who are doing like the real communication with people. Right? So everyone plays a role at every touch point in either strengthening or diminishing a brand. So that's another thing to remember. A third point that I'll make is your brand is more than your name or your logo. In fact, your name and your logo is like a really small part of it. if you have if people love your name and love your logo, it's not because they love the name and the logo, it's because they've had good experiences with your organization. When we rebranded, we had, I was actually amazed. A lot of people loved our name, and I was surprised by that. I thought, usually there's more kind of pushback with change. So I thought there would be, or maybe I just didn't hear from them. But I did hear from some people who were very vocal about, like, I hate your name. There's still time to change it. It's ridiculous. I heard all these things. And I had great conversations with them where I said, you know what, I love the fact that you hate our name and that you were honest about it. Because I know our name is not going to resonate with everyone. But what I love is that you actually care enough to talk to me about it, rather than just shrugging your shoulders and moving on, right? And so it's those experiences that strengthen the name. I'll bet you when Apple, who knows how Steve Jobs came up with the name Apple? Anyone know? Yeah. He liked apples. Yeah, he had just come back from an apple farm. He was on what he called a fruitarian diet. He had just come back from Oregon from an apple farm, and he told, what's the guy's name? Wozniacki. He told him, he's like, Apple, I love apples. It's a fun name. I like apples. We should call ourselves Apple. The Beatles brand was called Apple Records, so they got sued over it, right? But like over time, like, I'll bet you a lot of people are like, that is the dumbest name I have ever heard. You guys don't sell apples. You don't have an apple farm, right? It's not so much about what the name is, it's about what it represents. And it's representing all the experiences that people have with Apple, and the rest is history as far as that goes, right? So remember that your name and your logo as well, like, that's just a very small part of your brand. So if you're thinking about, like, should we change our name? Should we change our brand? Maybe. But that goes back to what I talked about with that conceptual framework. You need to understand your core identity, really understand who you are, why you exist, and that will help inform, like, does it make sense? You also need to know your audience and listen to them and find out, like, what are the strengths and weaknesses of our brand, of our name, of our logo, and that will help you figure out whether to change it or not. To speak really quickly, just briefly, on and this is probably an area where I diverge a little bit with frameworks. Actually, there's a lot I love about frameworks. There's some things I don't agree with. All right, now we're getting into it, right? If you have the name senior in your name, don't get rid of it. It's fine. Yeah, if you use the word seniors in your stories, keep it. Seniors is a great word, actually, unless, and this is where you need to know your audience, unless it's not a good word to use, in which case you shouldn't be using it. So I would probably just say, like, you need to understand your audience, you need to understand yourself, and then you can figure out, like, what's the right language to use, what's the right language not to use. I actually think seniors is a great word. I'm not a big fan of, and love your feedback on this, or anyone's feedback.
I'm going to jump in here, but go ahead.
I'm not a big fan of older adults and older people, because older is relative, and therefore it's confusing, depending on who you talk to. I asked my son, he's 9 years old, I was like, hey, when you think of older people, who do you think of? He started talking about high schoolers, right? So for a 9-year-old, older for him meant high schoolers. And as you go on up the age group, you're going to get different answers, and that's confusing. And if you confuse your audience, you're going to lose them, right? So you need to speak with clarity. Seniors, there's generally a shared understanding about the word seniors and what it means and who it's referring to. Now, I agree, like, there can be negative connotations to that, but I'm a big fan of actually reclaiming words rather than just giving up on them, where I think that the word seniors, in the context, when we talk about frame, like, all the things that go into the frame, senior, the word, is just a part of that. But if you're telling great story within that frame that reorients the word senior in a positive way, I think it can actually be a good thing where you can begin to reclaim it and push back against some of that implicit bias and negative connotations and things like that. So that's my perspective kind of on words like seniors or the way we use language. But at the end of the day, you got to serve your audience, right? You got to understand them and use the language that best serves them. That was a bit of a ramble, but I'll stop there.
Can I just add a really short counter rant?
Yeah.
So one of the things, and I've had to, like, explain this in 35 different workshops, and every time, kind of with the framework's talking point, And I have sort of come to actually exceed where Frameworks is going on this. Senior does otherize, and I've seen it now that I've kind of like crossed that boundary into senior, having turned 65 this year. It is really sort of interesting how there is this sort of otherizing. So I much prefer and agree with Frameworks recommendations to use neutral terms. If you want to be specific and your program is serving people age 50 plus or age 65 plus, simply describe who you're serving. There is an otherizing. I agree and now have seen a number of times how what the Frameworks research found about people being labeled senior, being less capable, et cetera, that there's a lot of validity to that. The other reason, and I know you were going to ask questions about what are takeaways for people who are, in the private markets, and I'm going to say among this is not Frameworks research, I'm taking off any Frameworks hat, and I'm distancing myself from Marissa. There's a lot of other research that shows that members of my generation absolutely despise the term senior. And so when senior centers or programs that are targeting my generation, baby boomer, are trying to attract people and they've got kind of senior all over it, we're like, well, that's not mine and that's not for me. So there are probably market reasons not to do it. But I think to your point, Sean, that's also where it's important to understand your market. But right now, I land solidly on the either older adult or older person, or simply being descriptive about if you're involved with the program, who this program targets, so we are not labeling or otherizing people simply based on age.
And I'm so happy that you brought that up, because that was my final question. And I feel like that's also the elephant in the room a little bit. And I think this is kind of where I was hoping we would end up actually in our dialogue, which was tossing that around a little bit, because I think it's something,
Right.
that's really where you start to get your hands
Right.
dirty and you start to figure out, okay, well, what's going on here, So with that, that's the end of our dialogue. Thanks for sticking around. And if we have some time for any questions. If anybody has a question, feel free to. Carrie, will you grab the mic and thanks.
Well, thank you all. And I was hoping you would talk about the linguistics. You said there was in the chart this morning something like, I don't know, many more linguistic people in your company. And so I was thinking about language and, with older people because that's who I work with. And I was thinking about even the term caregiving is really kind of beaten into the ground. And it's hard to, I work hard to try to come up with sort of natural language about things. Like, for instance, I think in our parents' generation, people who lived in what we used to call rest homes were called patients, and now even the word facility, I heard somebody say that's the F word. We can't talk about facilities, and anyway, it's just, I even when I go and visit an older person, I try to not use a clinical or medical term for the visit. I'll just say, I'm visiting, And so I just wondered if any of you, I guess, Marissa, your name is, if you've got some kind of great language suggestions for people who are professional visitors for older people.
So we did not test the word caregiver specifically. I would say in general, but I completely understand what you're saying, because there's a lot of research particularly in psychology, but also sociology, about the power of labeling and the ways in which it can stigmatize people, but also the ways in which, as Sean was saying, I'm going to mess up the last part of your name, I'm sorry. Sean Loy was saying we can recapture words and subvert their negative meanings, which is a beautiful thing. It takes a lot of time to do. So if caregiver or facility or words like that really make people feel uncomfortable, I think trying alternate words and trying descriptors, right? Like something that's just more general than that one word would be what my recommendation is. But I think that speaks to the ways in which there is so much implicit bias against people who are aging, and also fear about getting old and about health, that we continue to do research on and are trying to come up with better ways to kind of combat some of those negative connotations. I think that one thing to remember is that generally, not always, but generally, we don't have one communication with people, right? We have repeated opportunities to talk to people, maybe to for people to be exposed to the things that we're communicating as an organization. And again, just thinking of every one of those as being an opportunity to reframe. And if something's not going well, trying something different. I wish I had real empirical evidence about caregiving, and maybe we'll get funding to test that one as well, because that's a really great question.
I'm sorry, I have the mug, sorry, I'll give it to you after. I got it first. Question about your talking about individual storytelling. I do marketing and advertising for a continuum of care senior living community. And so, for a long time, a tried and true way of marketing and promoting a community is about the testimonial and my story, and then trying to help other people see themselves in that. So, given what you were talking about, is that a more frowned upon way of doing things, or would you say a testimonial campaign could be part of a whole branding if it were around a unifying positive message?
I mean, and you guys might want to answer as well. I'll just say very quickly that I think, yes, again, I'm not against individual stories by any means. I think they are powerful. I think you see them as opportunities to widen the lens and then use those testimonials as examples. I think one thing that I just want to say quickly, and we come up against this with a lot of topics we talk about, is that we are increasingly, I think, kind of across the board, relying on people who've gone through very difficult circumstances to tell their stories and telling them they have to tell it for social good. And that puts a lot of pressure on people who have lived under difficult circumstances. That might not be the case every time. People might be telling a great story about how things have really gone great for them. But like that story I was telling you earlier about the woman tearing the paper, or we see this a lot in immigration or in sexual violence, the pressure that we put on people to tell their story over and over again can be another form of trauma we're inflicting them on. And so that for me, that makes me feel a little uncomfortable. But go ahead.
And I just, so to the continuing care retirement community, so I mentioned that we did house parties, and one of the things our change agents are doing, they're just kind of showing up and talking about aging, ageism, and also some of these messages in different places. What has turned out, and one of our change agents is someone who works in a continuing care retirement community. One of the things she's reported that really resonated is that whole idea of older people gaining strength and momentum and wisdom and I often don't see that in marketing material for anything anywhere. It's sort of like, here we are playing golf and but it doesn't have that meaning and purpose. So I am not a marketing professional, but if I were going to, I think testimonials are great for anything, but as opposed to individual story, how are you infusing how people want to see themselves as they get older? Encore.org and Stanford University did a great study that everybody should look at about the desire of people as they get older for more meaning and purpose. And I think that has a lot of implications for thinking about how we tell the stories about aging as well. And it leverages so nicely to me with the embracing the dynamic building, the momentum metaphor that Frameworks talks about.
What I'd say is, have you ever been to a art museum and you go up to a painting and you see it, and then you walk up really close and you start looking at it, and you back up and you kind of get the wide view. Those are both really valuable parts of experiencing the fullness of that painting. And so I think it's the same true with story, right? Again, having those details, those individual testimonials are really powerful. Having that wide view is also very important, finding ways to bring those together. So testimonials are great. However, I would say don't do testimonials just because you're oh, we should do testimonials, right? Well, why? Why do you do testimonials? Why are they powerful? And what are the powerful ones? And I think part of it goes back to, again, understanding the person reading that testimonial. It's can they see themselves in that story? And sometimes I'll acknowledge some of the things I'm talking about might feel a little bit abstract of how do we really drill down in practical ways? But there's just truth to, when we read testimonials, the ones that really resonate with us, it's not because they're so amazing, it's because we can see ourselves in that. And so I think testimonials are a really powerful way to tell that overall story. Yeah.
Can you speak to the challenge of trying to tell a story to such a broad age spectrum? Because we serve starting at 55, and if we're saying that's an older adult, I'm a year away from that. I don't feel like an older adult. I'm still out at the gym and doing all my stuff. And I think a lot of people don't identify as an older adult until they're in the 60s, if I may generalize, but yet that's who we say we serve. So can you speak to that challenge of appealing to that two-generation span?
So I just want to say a couple of things. One, what I've found most useful in the people who have been kind of trying to reframe and change the narrative is to be descriptive about what you're doing in terms of age and not I mean, the essence of ageism is making judgments or stereotypes, right, about people based on the number that happens to be their age. And that's what we're trying to move away from in changing the narrative. So I think saying, you know, we have these kind of programs for people age 55 plus, and we do this for people who are age, you know, 70 plus with these characteristics or whatever, but being really descriptive about what you do. In terms of appeal, I think it's no different than, in a way, any other age group. When you think about it, you know, the lifespan of 55 to 80, you wouldn't in any way talk about in one set of language for people who are between the ages of 20 and 50. And yet somehow once people hit 50, it's like you're all older. So I think it's just, I think it goes back to what you were saying, Sean, about being really careful and knowing who you're talking to and that they're not all getting one message. You know, there were probably funding reasons, legislative reasons why you serve different populations with different age groups, because those are embedded in legislation. But it doesn't mean that in your messaging to them that there has to be just kind of the one message, whether you call it senior, older adult, older person. I think to me, when you're serving a large, over a large lifespan, being descriptive in terms of age or any other characteristics has been really helpful.
And I would just add, it is a really hard nut to crack. It is a challenge. And so one thing that you can consider doing as you're thinking about, okay, how do I tell this story to these different age groups is again, drilling down and figuring out what's just the human element to it. What's something that's just a very human, like an example is like, right, like we all need to eat food, right? And so that's a fundamental human need. And there's a million restaurants out there. How do we decide which ones to go to, right? You can pick, right? We have our different reasons why we might pick one, but it's a fundamental human need, and it's the restaurant that can communicate things that appeal to something that's very fundamentally human that goes along with the need to eat food that might cause them to go there instead of somewhere else, even if the food's not as good. But it's trying to drill down into that and say, look, whether you're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, we all feel this. As human beings. And so if you can find some of those and begin to infuse that into your stories, that can be helpful to kind of bridge some of those gaps. But again, it's not easy because some things are very specific. You can't they're specific to seniors. Right? And so
Because you're sitting right here, I want 20. Okay.
So I know that's not very helpful to affirm that it is hard, but
Right.
it's worth really kind of digging into the meat of that and kind of wrestling with that challenge.
I've got to wrap. So that's it. Thank you so much, Marissa Garstine-Pinot, Janine Vanderberg, and Shunloi Fong. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.